I had chapter 9 on issues and concerns in systematic theology. I thought I will just put them together. Chapter 8, chapter 9 will just be one chapter, and that's chapter 8. And I'll briefly talk about what are the issues and concerns in systematic theology. All right. um, okay. Somebody came just in. Now, when we started, I think in chapter 3, I spoke about different types of theology. The question, of course, to ask is, which one of those would be considered systematic theology? What is systematic theology? Or would all of them be considered systematic theology? I guess if it is a theology that is systematic, can you hear me now better? Okay. I made mention that there are different ways of categorizing theology. It depends on what is your perspective. For example, John Ron's classification would be by theologies, what are ologies. So you have a Christology, ecclesiology, hamartiology. Hamartiology is about sin, theology of sin. Hamartia in Greek means sin. Heresiology is about heresies. Mariology is about Mary. And soteriology about salvation. Normally, Christology and soteriology come together, normally. Or we can also talk about types of theology according to subject matter. For example, apophatic and cataphatic. Apophatic coming from above, and cataphatic will be coming from below. So, or in other words, starting point is God, or starting point is humanity, our existence, our experience. Or we can speak about ascetical theology, has to do with more a kind of spirituality. It's a branch of spiritual theology. Biblical theology, basically talking about scriptures. What is the theology behind the books in the New Testament and in the Old Testament? Or dogmatic theology, basically talking about the dogmas or the teachings of the church. Okay. And then Eucharistic theology would be on the Eucharist. Fundamental theology, this is the course now, talking about the fundamentals of theology. And liturgical theology would have to do with liturgy. Okay. Or you can also classify them according to moral theology, what you take up with Father Roland Tuason is moral theology, in fundamentals of moral theology, the way of acting. It's like the theological type of ethics. Or mystical theology, talking about spirituality. Spiritual theology actually has two, ascetical theology and mystical theology. Or natural theology, either could be ecological, or it could be something to do with just nature. In other words, creation also. Or practical theology, which normally is called pastoral theology. Sacramental theology, this is about the sacraments. And systematic theology, something to do more or less similar to dogmatic theology, but actually systematic would cover both dogmatic theology and moral theology. According to church tradition, you can also talk about this. Anglican, Baptist, Lutheran, Orthodox, Methodist, Roman Catholic, or ecumenical type of theology. Or by place of original practice, Alexandrian, Antiochian, Mercersburg, normally Protestant. Princeton would be the Presbyterian theology, or Lutheran. Or by the method. They have comparative theology. We usually compare. Normally, this is the theology that is used when we talk about interreligious dialogue. So you compare the different types of doing theology In terms of content, in terms of method, you compare what the Catholics would do from the with what the Anglicans, the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, and other Christian denominations, what they would do in regard to theology. There's also the dialectical critical theology, which is basically, this is not the critical theology in terms of method. This is the dialectical theology that is associated with the modern Protestants, especially Karl Barth. Okay. Hermeneutical theology has to do with interpretation, where most of the time it's like the model for interpreting scriptures as well as the teachings of the church. Narrative theology has to do with it's a methodology of doing theology by way of stories, and people are influenced by the way Jesus would teach in the New Testament. It's by parables and by stories. That is one kind of theology. The other one is neo-orthodox. This is the not the orthodox of several centuries back, but the more what we updated orthodox theology. Someone like John Ciziollas is a neo-orthodox. He looks more from the perspective of ecumenism. Or postmodern theology, which is basically going beyond the modernist perspective. It's a more contemporary type of theology. Also, we can speak about theology as relating to philosophy, existentialist, Marxist, or process. The process could also be used in terms of method because the process is method, except that this is probably better here, classified here, because there is what we call process philosophy. So the methodology in process philosophy is actually the same methodology that is used in process theology. Or by the issues it tackles. For example, crisis, the whole idea of the completely autonomous character of the divine as opposed to the character of the human. Or you could talk about eco-theology, has to do with ecology, or feminist, mujerista, womanist theology, talking about women's issues, or the gay and lesbian theology from the perspective of personal identity. We call this identity Christology, theology. Liberation theology, as we have already talked about. There's a black liberation theology. There's a Burakumin theology. There's the Dalit. Burakumin is part of the, what is this? More the part of Indian. Dalit is also Alit. Minjung would be more Korean, has to do with liberation. Although feminist theology can also be considered as liberation theology. Then there is the neurotheology, has to do with neurosis, with it's more close to psychoanalysis, psychoanalytical theology. And then there is the political theology, has to do with politics. Now, what we talked about was fundamental. We have been talking about fundamental theology. And as you can see in the picture, what I'm trying to say here is that fundamental theology is basically foundational. You are laying the foundation for your future work in theology by means of fundamental theology. So what you actually take up in fundamental theology, the more updated fundamental theology, not the apologetical theology. It used to be called the apologetical theology, but no longer. Fundamental theology after the Second Vatican Council is basically a theology about the foundational ideas and processes that we need to know about before we go into the systematic type of theology. Okay, so this is what actually we have taken up. We talk about the two poles in fundamental theology, the pole of human experience and the pole of Judeo-Christian tradition. Human experience refers to our own experience, exclusive of the data of faith. Whereas Judeo-Christian tradition, we'll be talking about human experience, but from a decidedly Judeo, Jewish, or Christian tradition, the perspective. So we take into consideration the input that we have received from the Bible and from the 2,000 years of church tradition. In fundamental theology, we also learned how we can articulate our faith and precisely what kind of criteria we are going to use in order to determine whether a particular faith articulation is acceptable or not acceptable, as well as on the role of the community, who is going to be uh, given the responsibility of determining whether what we believe is right or wrong. And then, of course, fundamental theology exposed us to the method that we do in theology. Method basically takes cognizance of the fact that we have a plural environment. In other words, an environment that has different, in fact, different experiences. We're talking here about cultural differences, worldview differences, as well as other philosophical differences. Okay. And in the method theology, of course, we are very much concerned about being faithful to the core event of our faith, which is the revelation in Jesus Christ. Okay. So we spoke about methodology in fundamental theology, and all throughout we were using that kind of methodology, bringing together, reading together, making two things together, two poles together to dialogue with each other, the pole of human experience and the pole of Judeo-Christian tradition, which is basically procedural or methodology. Now, when we talk about systematic theology, we are now talking into different areas, different fields, we may say, fields in theology. And when you take this up, some are called systematic theology because they are using a kind of a systematic methodology. Others are simply just what is this a reflection on a particular area in church life. So, for example, we talk about dogmatic theology. As I said, dogmatic theology will have to do with teachings, our pronouncements, normally the articles of our faith. Okay, dogmatic theology. That is normally the part of, let's say, theology, or you can even say catechism, that has to do with the faith beliefs, what we believe. Okay, we believe in 10 Commandments, we believe in the church, and all the other articles of faith that we need to believe found in the creed, in the Nicene Constantinopolitan Creed. So that would be a systematic theology, but it is talking only about dogmas, about the teachings of the church. Then there is the sacramental theology, which is part of systematic theology, because it talks about the sacraments, but from a certain type of methodology. So you're talking here about sacramental theology that is much more like related to what do you call this, dogmatic theology, but from focusing only on the sacraments, the theology of the sacraments, the theology of the liturgy. Moral theology has to do, as I said, with the uh, the way we behave, the way we behave, the way we live, the way we put into practice our the truths of our faith. So that it would be moral theology. Biblical theology is part of systematic theology insofar as it is not talking about exegetical theology, but rather biblical theology. In other words, what are the themes? What are the concerns in the Bible that are the concerns also of theology? For example, when we talk about the uh, the theology of Paul in regard to this is Paul, the Apostle Paul, in regard to ecclesiology. That is that could be called part of a biblical theology. We talk about the church. What does he mean by the church? What does he mean by mission? So that would be part biblical theology. Then historical theology has to do with history, how theology developed according to history or the different times in the history. And this is a very interesting theology, very interesting course, but most of the time that is incorporated usually with the other areas or other concerns. I'll show it to you how it is incorporated. And then pastoral theology has to do more with what you do in terms of pastoral programs or pastoral involvement, immersions, etc. And then you reflect on what you have undertaken, what you have been immersed into, or what you have done in terms of pastoral activities. Spiritual theology would be more in the realm of the spiritual uh, spiritual practices. Now, what is the basic theological framework of spirituality? And then we talk about different types of spiritualities: Benedictine, Dominican, Augustinian, Franciscan, Jesuit, etc. Okay, that would be spiritual theology. More often than not, the spiritual theology is taken up in the novitiate. For those of you who are taking novitiate, those of you who are religious, that is usually the place or the time when you take up spirituality or spiritual theology, because that is supposed to be preparatory to coming to theology itself. All right. Now, in regard to proper themes, systematic theology normally would focus on individual themes, theological themes. For example, about God. But more specifically, you talk about God from the Christian perspective. Therefore, you're going to talk about not only monotheism, but you're talking about Trinity, triune God, therefore. So very specific. There's a course on the Trinity. Or you can talk about Christology or Christ and his role in the salvation of humankind. So we talk about Christ in the sense of who he is, what his message is, and how does what is his meaning as far as we are concerned. How did people think of Christ all throughout, let's say, 2,000 years? What are the differences between them, and how should we think about Christ today? Okay, that would be Christology. Ecclesiology will be talking about the church. What is the nature of the church? What are the specific elements in the church? What are how do we speak about the church in terms of, let's say, the hierarchy, in terms of the leaders of the church, or the what we will call the authorities in the church? And how about the role of the laity? And then what is the church being called to do? So the church is being called to continue the mission of Jesus himself. And then we talk also about the other members of the church, like not only lay people, not only the clergy, but also the religious. Where did the religious come in? And normally, it's in ecclesiology where we include the uh, treatise on Mary, because according to Lumen Gentium, Mary should be taken as the model of what it means to be church. And that is why in Lumen Gentium, the last chapter is on Mary as the model of the church, as the mother of the church. And then you have sacramental and liturgical theology. And these are how to do with the sacraments. And normally they're divided into three categories: the sacraments of initiation, meaning baptism, confirmation, and Eucharist. Eucharist is as First Communion. So they are the sacraments of initiation. Then the sacraments of healing, basically sacrament of penance or reconciliation, and the sacrament of the anointing of the sick. Okay. Then the sacraments of vocation, basically talking about sacraments of orders, ordination, and the sacrament of marriage. They are sacraments of vocation. And then lastly, usually the last course in systematic theology is on creation and eschatology. You might think that we should be talking about creation at the beginning. Yes, but this particular course normally puts we call them the first and the last things. The first thing, creation. The last things, of course, is the eschaton or the final judgment. So creation eschatology is usually one course. Now, systematic theology, according to some, also includes fundamental moral theology or moral theology. Actually, dogmatic theology and moral theology are what we would call branches of systematic theology. Primarily, especially nowadays, primarily because their methodology is pretty much the same. So they are part of systematic theology by reason of methodology. Now, in fundamental moral theology, you'll be also have some courses that are going to be separate and by themes. For example, Christian and sexual morality, life in biomedical ethics, the theology of creation, and Catholic social teaching. Okay, as you can see, most of these courses have to do with how we live, how we conduct ourselves, not just the teaching, but how we conduct ourselves. It's like, as I said, it's the ethics part of theology. Okay, so, but if somebody tells you that fundamental or that moral theology is separate from systematic theology, what he is basically talking about is that dogmatic theology is different from moral theology. Normally, moral theology and dogmatic theology are the ones that are distinguished. Dogmatic theology and moral theology, they are two branches of what we would call systematic theology. But there are people who would consider simply systematic theology only dogmatic theology. Well, as I said, depending on the method itself. Okay, now is there any order in regard to the taking up systematic courses? This is what we call systematic courses. Uh, well, I myself, I have a preference on a particular order in regard to the courses in systematic theology. I have always found out that I think if you do it properly, if you follow a certain order, then it is much easier for you to develop from one course to another. So after fundamental theology, then you can take up the other courses in dogmatic theology or in systematic theology. But I would definitely would say fundamental theology is basic, so you should take it up. Because if without fundamental theology, it's difficult for you to know about Christology, about Trinity, about ecclesiology, about sacramental theology, because that presupposes, those courses presuppose kind of a basic framework for theology. Okay, but more specifically, I myself would prefer that everybody should take up after fundamental theology. They should take up Christology, and the reason for that is Christology is central in our theology. And especially in systematic theology, we should make sure that everybody has an understanding of who Christ is before we go into the Trinity. You might say, Trinity and Church, you might say, why not talk about triune God? Well, the reason I would put triune God after Christology is because it is Christ who reveals to us that God is Father, Son, and Spirit. But if you don't know anything about Christ first, before you talk about the Trinity, then you may not be able to understand fully the impact of the Trinitarian framework of the church, and the Trinitarian framework of our life. So it is important that you know first who Christ is, what he means for us. After that, then you can go into the Trinity. You talk about the Father, Son, and Spirit, first by talking about how Christ revealed to us that God is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. In that way, your idea of the Trinity is something that is based on the Bible, because there is no other place where the Trinity is revealed except in the Bible. Later on, of course, later theologians would reflect on the data that we have in the Bible. So, knowing God, now we are able to move to the next tract or the next theme in systematic theology, which is ecclesiology, the meaning of the church. Again, it is important that we know who Christ is and who God is before we start talking about the ecclesiology, about the church. If we simply talk about the ecclesiology after fundamental theology, we would not have the background of who Christ is and who God is. And the reason for that is because the church is no other than the body of Christ. If you don't know anything about Christ, then how can you call the church the body of Christ? So know first about Christ, about God as Father, Son, and Spirit, and then we will be able to know something about the church. The basic, the fundamental nature of the church is that it is in the image and likeness of God, Father, Son, and Spirit, but precisely it is the body of Christ here alive. As a church, we are the body of Christ, and we are the ones who are acting now on behalf of Jesus Christ in our world today. That is the very essence of the church. And then from there would flow what we mean by sacraments, what we mean by the liturgy, what we mean by baptism, confirmation, the Eucharist, what we mean by reconciliation, about healing, or what we mean by being ordained to a ministry or being dedicated, called to a very particular kind of life, which is married life. And then when you start talking about the future, you talk about eschatology. But before you could talk about eschatology, of course, you would need to talk about creation. How did all of this come about? And then where is it heading to? And then you start talking about eschatology. What is going to be the next after this life? Okay, now, systematic theology in terms of methodology basically would follow these steps. In all my systematic theology courses, I follow these steps because I think it is a very good methodology. It makes you understand uh, a particular theme in systematic theology in a very rich way, in a very deep way, in a very historical way, because you are presented with something that covers almost everything, but in a systematic way. Okay. For example, systematic theology would start with status questionis. I think most of you are familiar with status questionis. In other words, what is the state of the question? State of the question means what is the situation? What is the current situation on a particular theme? For example, the church. We talk about the theme of the church. What is the status questionis of the church? In other words, what is the present situation of the church now? The number one present situation of the church now is that it is a world church. It's a global church. It's no longer simply a church of Asia, a church of Europe, a church of Rome, a church of Jerusalem, a church of Palestine, but it's now a world church. That is the status questionis. Okay. So we lay out first what is the situation in regard to the church now, as we find it, as we experience it now. We are here living as a church, but what we call the local church. Okay, and then we go through our life as a local church in a way that almost all Christians go through their own life, except that we are distinct in our ways of, let's say, worship, in our way of proclaiming, in our way of the language that we use, in our way of presenting ourselves. And after laying out the current situation and a particular theme, then we go back to the Bible. Again, if you remember our methodology here, methodology is that we first of all talk about the human experience, and that is the status questionis. That is the human experience. Basically, what is the human experience now? And then we talk about Bible references. This is what we would call part of the Judeo-Christian tradition. And this is the starting point of Judeo-Christian tradition, the Bible. What does the Bible have to say about, let's say, the church? What do the evangelists, what does Jesus say about the church? What do the evangelists say about the church? What does Paul say about the church? Okay, so that's very important because you have to ground your theology of the church on what we find in the scriptures. But beyond that, we need to go further. And that is where we study the historical development on the theme. What is the teaching of the church fathers, the scholastics, the Reformed, in other words, the Protestant, the Tridentine, Vatican II. So you talk about these different things. In regard to the church, where are the things, what are the points where they come together? And what are the points where they don't agree? So this is part of the discussion on the historical development on the theme. Okay. And then after that, after you finish the historical development, then you develop it in a systematic treatment of sub-themes. The theme, for example, the church will have different sub-themes. For example, the church as a mystery. Okay, that would be one sub-theme. So you need to discuss what it means to say the church is a mystery. Or the church is the people of God. What do we mean by the people of God? Are we going to talk about simply Christians, or are we including also people who are also religious, but they are not Christians? So where is the basis, ecclesiological basis for interreligious dialogue? So that would be one area. Another area would be the hierarchical aspect of the church. Where does the hierarchical aspect of the church fit into the whole program of the church and the whole structure of the church? Where does it fit? And where do the lay people fit in this regard? Where do the religious fit into this? And then we talk about why are we called to become part of the church? For holiness, for salvation, etc. And then we talk about the other groups that are called also to be members of the church, but in a special way. For example, the one who are leaders, the ones who are ordained, as well as the ones who dedicate themselves in consecrated life, the religious. So these are different themes, and as when you do the systematic treatment, you have to cover all of these things, be able to discuss them. Next, then of course there will be some issues and concerns that need to be addressed. We may not be able to cover everything, but what are now the predominant issues that are important for us to address? So in a way, when we talk about this part, issues and concerns, we are going back to the status questionis and recovering or readdressing the matters that have been taken up already in the status questionis. What are the issues and concerns that need to be addressed here and now? We don't need to talk about something that's very, very expansive or very long in terms of coverage. We're talking about issues and concerns today. What are the issues and concerns today? For example, if we talk about the church, the number one issue and concern today is what we call synodality, which is different from collegiality, but synodality, being a synod, being together as a community, but agreeing and being able to articulate what we believe, synodality. So that would be a concern. And then, of course, we go into the practical applications. How do we put everything that we have discussed into practice? What are the guidelines that we could use in order to, let's say, bring this down to people in terms of their catechism, or in terms of catechesis, or in terms of application in the way we live our lives, or in the way we organize ourselves. For example, if we want to be a church, a real living church, then there is what we call the domestic church, which is the family. What is the implication of our idea of church on the family? So, or what is the implication of our idea of the church on a school, or in a seminary? What are the implications? Those are the things that we will be discussing in the practical implications. All right, so this is the methodology that makes it systematic methodology. Okay, now just elaborating a bit more on each of those points. For example, in the status questionis, Normally, if you are taking a course for the whole semester, you have enough time to cover these things. So, aside from talking about the current situation on a particular theme, you review related literature. The professor or the lecturer will be talking about the ideas of people in talking about the church today. And normally that's always very important because precisely they are the ones who know or who tell us what are these areas, what are the sub themes that need to be paid attention to. Okay. What are the pros and cons in the recent debate? Okay. We need to be aware of those things. What are the challenges that the what do you call it, the authors or the discussants will be talking about? What are the challenges that we have to face in regard to the theme, for example, the theme on the church? And then how do we assess the direction where we are headed? Or here we can also talk about what is our methodology, what methodology are you going to follow. But normally this is already implied in the way the course is set up. Now, in regard to the biblical references, we look in the Old Testament, in the New Testament. For example, on Christology, you talk about different, what is the main message of Jesus? And you talk, of course, about the death, the resurrection of Jesus. What do they mean? What do the scriptures mean when they talk about the death and the resurrection of Jesus, the passion of Jesus? What do they mean by that? Okay, what do they mean by the ascension and the coming down of the Spirit? Okay. What are the opinions of reliable authors in regard to these different elements in the Bible? And what is the essential message of the Bible in regard to, let's say, Christ or in regard to the church? Okay. The reason why we want to identify exactly what is the essential message of the Bible is because that is going to guide us as we go through the not only the history, but as we develop it in a systematic way later on. So the historical development of the teaching, as I said, we talk about the different historical ideas that have been used to express or to articulate this teaching, this particular teaching. For example, when we talk about the Trinity, what does, let's say, the fathers of the church say about the Trinity? What do the Antiochian schools or the Alexandrian schools of theology in the early part of the fathers of the church, what do they say in regard to the Trinity? Okay. And then later on, how does Thomas Aquinas, for example, develop his Trinitarian theology or his ecclesiology or his Christology? And the same thing with Luther and the other Protestant reformers. What are their ideas? How do they explain these things? And then the Council of Trent, of course, because the Council of Trent is important. It's one of the more important councils in the church. And then, of course, Vatican II. What does Vatican II have to say about Christology, about ecclesiology, about the Trinity, etc.? Okay. Then the systematic treatment of sub-themes. You have sub-themes, as I said, for example, you talk about the Trinity, there are different sub-themes that need to be understood. What is understood by being one? What is understood by being three? Okay. What is understood by the whole Christian reality as Trinitarian? That basically we are really operating on a Trinitarian mode. What is the meaning of that? Okay. Then specific direction, what we would like to pursue. Okay, let's say there are now people who are more interested in talking about unity. The unity in the Trinity as an example of the unity for us. You could explore on that. Or if you are the one teaching the course or if you are the one doing the study, then what is your position? This is where normally the teacher or the professor would state his position. And then again, issues and concerns. There will always be some issues that cannot be resolved for the time being. Okay, just it's important to pinpoint those issues and concerns because you may not be able to discuss them, but maybe other people will be able to discuss them. Any people who would read your article or who would be in the class who would be interested, you might be able to discuss it further or do some research on it. And then practical implications. How do you make the theme more understandable and more of practical use to your audience? Okay, so these are what we would call the different ways of setting up a kind of a systematic course itself. So from here on, you should be able to know already how a professor will be able to take up, let's say, the course on ecclesiology. How will he go about it? You have already an idea of how it's going to do it. First, status questionis. What is the situation now? Second, you have talked about the Bible, biblical references. And then you talk about historical development. And you talk about a systematic presentation. And then, of course, the practical things, issues and concerns, as well as the practical implications. If you're going to talk about Christology, the same kind of a format. Now, if there is somebody, there's a professor who would not follow this kind of system, of course, he's free to do that, he's free to do that. Then there are a lot of loose ends sometimes that would be difficult to reconcile. But when you develop it in a systematic way, then you more or less are assured that you will cover as much of the scope of the theme as possible. As I said, you cannot cover everything. Besides, you only have one semester. And many of these courses, for example, when you go into the license level or the doctoral level, many of these courses will only take up one particular subject matter. For example, if you talk about the Bible, when I was taking up the Bible in the doctoral level, we only talk about Exodus and only one chapter of Exodus for the whole semester. That is what we were taking up. But that's already in the higher level of theology. So if you talk about, let's say, theology, we only talk about liberation theology, only one kind of theology, or feminist theology, only one theology. But this level, the level of the MA here, we are talking about the basic ground for theology. And that is why we try to be as systematic as we can be in offering the courses so that you have it is like building up or erecting a building. You put one stone after another. If you have the proper stones put at the bottom, then you have a good basis, you have a good foundation. When you put on top of it, on top of these stones, the other stones, these are already other ideas, higher ideas in a way. So the more you go into the actually doctoral level, the more you get specific, very specific. And some people will just talk about the idea of Karl Rahner in regard to the Trinity. Only that. That is your subject matter for the whole semester. That's already very, very specific. Okay. But once you are aware of the methodology that you follow, talk about the Bible, talk about the what we call the human experience, what is the status questionis, what is the problem now, what are the issues concerned now, the Bible, the history, and then the systematic theology and practical theology. Basically the methodology in any course. So in any course that you go to, you look for these things. How are you going to develop? So when the professor gives you the syllabus, you automatically scan what are the areas in theology that they are going to be discussing, and what belongs to the Bible, what belongs to history, what belongs to systematic theology, what belongs to the practical issues. So you have a clear mind. So that is what systematic theology offers us, at least a perspective or a methodology that is clear and as complete as possible. Okay, this is where we end my discussion on systematic theology. Now, I'd like to explain to you about